What is the actual public opinion on immigration, though? Do we know that in Britain? Because that seems to me a
Yeah,
better way of measuring than voting.
yeah. Well, voting measures to some extent messily public opinion weighted by salience or how much people care, whereas public opinion, uh, when measuring attitudes, is just um, the level of support or opposition to particular things. But in the case of immigration, yeah, somewhere between a half and two-thirds of people in Britain would like immigration reduced, given the information they currently have. Of course, some of
Right.
them may be misinformed about the level and about the consequences,
Hmm.
but we have to separate actual beliefs from potential beliefs. And this is in contrast to the situation around the time of Enoch Powell's speech, where 75 to 80% of people were against immigration. In other words, when there was an overwhelming consensus.
Hmm.
Now, I think it's fair to say that a majority wants less immigration, but it's not an overwhelming majority, at
Okay.
least according to some reasonable survey questions that have been fielded by pollsters that are trustworthy. Now, aside from the overall level, there's also levels of opposition to particular categories. People are particularly opposed to asylum seekers arriving in small boats, which is understandable. If people literally just turn up on the beach
Right.
without any kind of due process, at least at the point of their arrival.
Horrifying flashbacks of the Vikings invading, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah, intergenerational trauma triggered. But they're much less opposed in these surveys to many categories that represent large immigration flows into Britain of people, some of whose skills and other characteristics may not be most beneficial in the long run.
Right.
And then, but of course, you can also ask about different countries of origin, and there you do find that people tend to be more opposed to people from more culturally distant countries and
Hmm.
countries with uh, whose inhabitants in the UK tend to have higher crime rates. But that's a whole separate discussion, which is interesting. Then there's the issue of salience, which I've mentioned a few times. How much do people actually care? Because people can a large percentage of people can hold a particular view, but if they care far more about another issue, and if the parties who are promising to do something on the first issue are promising to do something completely different on the second issue,
Right.
the electoral process will um, not lead to the outcome the people who care about the first issue really want. And what you basically find is, yeah, about not a sizable percentage of people who say they want to reduce immigration don't consider it the most important or even the second most important issue.
Hmm.
So, for example, Labour voters, who are currently the single largest bloc, even though it's much less than an overall majority,
Hmm.
don't care nearly as much as about immigration as the Conservative and Reform voters. And this is even despite the fact that many Labour voters still are working class white British people.
Hmm.
I, of course, Labour's base includes large numbers of ethnic minorities and you know students and middle class people that regard the Tories and the Reform as frightfully ghastly. There are still a sizable number of white working class people who vote for Labour, but among Labour voters at the beginning of the year, immigration wasn't even in the top five most important issues.
Mm.
They don't care about things like the NHS and public services and housing, which is understandable. Housing is a very serious problem in the UK.
Right.
The lack of it or the price of it.
Hmm.
So restrictionists need to be aware of the complexities of public opinion. It's not as simple as just a majority want less. Therefore, the fact that we haven't got it uh, is it must represent a conspiracy. I mean, I do think
Right.
I do think that elites have acted irresponsibly and indeed have ignored or betrayed their voters, particularly in the case of the Conservatives.
Right.
But the the overall picture is somewhat more complicated than many conservatives, people on the online right, realize.